Most people think a pawn shop makes its money one way. You bring in a gold chain, they hand you cash, and a month later you pay it back with interest. Simple, right? Here's the problem with that theory. If that's genuinely all a pawn shop did, most of them would be bankrupt within 2 years. The interest alone doesn't come close to covering what it actually costs to run one of these stores. So today we're exposing the real math behind pawn shops, the part they don't put on the sign out front. Let's start with the number everyone assumes is the whole story: interest rates. Depending on the state, pawn shops can legally charge anywhere from 10 to 25% interest per month on a loan. That sounds enormous compared to a bank, and it is. But here's the detail almost nobody accounts for. Pawn shops don't lend anywhere close to what an item is actually worth. If you walk in with a gold necklace worth $200, you're not walking out with $200. You're walking out with somewhere between $50 and $100, because pawn shops typically only lend 25 to 50% of an item's resale value. Why so low? Because the shop has to protect itself against exactly what happens next, and this is the part most people never think through. A huge percentage of these loans never get repaid. People don't come back for their items constantly. Life happens, priorities shift, an unexpected bill takes priority, and the item just gets left behind. When that happens, the pawn shop doesn't lose money. It keeps the collateral free and clear. And this is where the interest rate story completely falls apart, because the real profit engine isn't the interest at all. It's what happens to the stuff people never come back for. When a loan isn't repaid, the pawn shop now legally owns that item outright at a fraction of its actual value. That necklace they lent $75 against, they can now sell at retail for 2 to 3 times what they loaned out. This single mechanic, forfeited collateral turning into retail inventory, typically makes up around 60% of a pawn shop's total revenue. Interest income, the thing everyone assumes is the main business, is usually closer to 40%. Let that sink in for a second. The loan shark reputation pawn shops have is mostly built on a revenue stream that isn't even their biggest one. So here's the real business model laid out plainly. A pawn shop isn't primarily a lender. It's a secondhand retailer that uses lending as its inventory acquisition strategy. Instead of buying stock from a wholesaler like a normal store would, a pawn shop effectively buys inventory from customers who need quick cash, except they only pay for it if the customer never comes back to reclaim it. Either outcome works in the shop's favor. If the loan gets repaid, they collect interest that can run as high as 95% gross margin, because their only real cost was the cash they lent out in the first place. If the loan doesn't get repaid, they get to sell that item at retail margins between 35 and 60%, often 2 to 3 times what they originally loaned against it. There is genuinely no losing outcome once the loan is written correctly. Every deal a pawn shop makes is structured so that whichever way it plays out, the shop comes out ahead. That's the part that makes this business so much smarter than people give it credit for. And it's also why state regulators keep such a close eye on loan-to-value ratios, because the incentive to lend as little as possible against an item just to guarantee a profitable resale later is baked directly into the model. But even with margins like that on both sides, one number kills far more independent pawn shops than bad loans ever do. And it has nothing to do with interest rates or theft. It's inventory turnover. Here's what that actually means. A pawn shop's money is sitting in a display case, not in a bank account. Every ring, guitar, power tool, and gaming console taking up shelf space is cash that isn't earning anything until it sells. Successful pawn shops are turning their entire inventory over 2 to 3 times a year. Struggling ones let items sit for months, sometimes years, tying up cash the business desperately needs to keep making new loans. A shop can have fantastic margins on paper, 60% here, 90% there, and still run out of usable cash, simply because too much of its money is frozen in inventory sitting on a shelf collecting dust instead of collecting interest. This is why the best-run pawn shops obsess over what they lend against in the first place. Jewelry and gold move fast and hold value predictably. Gold in particular barely depreciates, which is exactly why you'll notice pawn shops lean heavily towards gold and jewelry loans whenever they can get them. Electronics depreciate fast and go out of style within a year or two, which makes them riskier collateral even though customers bring them in constantly, practically begging the shop to take that old laptop or game console off their hands. Tools and musical instruments sit somewhere in the middle. They hold value reasonably well, but they take longer to find the right buyer. The shops that survive long-term aren't necessarily the ones charging the highest interest. They're the ones that are ruthlessly disciplined about what they'll actually lend against and how quickly they can turn dead inventory back into cash before it becomes dead weight on a shelf. If you're finding this kind of business breakdown useful, you'll probably enjoy the deep dive we did on how Costco actually makes its billions. It's linked below, and it uses a surprisingly similar psychological trick to keep customers coming back. Now here's a piece of this business that almost never gets talked about. Pawn shops are, in a strange way, one of the most recession-resistant business models in the country, and the reason is almost the opposite of what you'd expect. When the economy struggles, people assume pawn shops suffer along with everyone else. In reality, the opposite tends to happen. When people are short on cash and banks won't approve them for a personal loan, pawn shops become one of the only places left that will lend money same day. No credit check required, no lengthy application process, no waiting a week to hear back. Loan volume tends to go up during tough economic stretches, not down. At the same time, more people are willing to sell off jewelry, tools, and electronics outright for quick cash, rather than pawn them, which feeds directly into that high-margin retail side of the business. So while most retailers are terrified of a recession, a well-run pawn shop is often positioned to do better, not worse. That's an incredibly rare trait for a small business to have. Most industries move in the same direction as the broader economy, but this one quietly moves in reverse. And it's part of why private equity and larger pawn chains have been quietly consolidating smaller operators, buying up smaller operators and running them under shared inventory systems, shared point-of-sale software, and centralized online resale channels that individual mom-and-pop shops could never afford to build on their own. Put the whole picture together, and pawn shops start to look nothing like the stereotype most people carry around. It's not a shady loan shark operation surviving off desperate people paying insane interest. It's a dual revenue retail and lending business, where every loan is structured so that the shop wins either way it plays out, either through high margin interest or through high margin resale on items customers never return for. The real killer of most pawn shops isn't predatory lending gone wrong. It's cash getting trapped in inventory that sits too long on a shelf, and the entire business tends to get stronger, not weaker, exactly when the broader economy is struggling. None of that shows up when you glance at a pawn shop window full of guitars and gold chains. From the sidewalk, it looks like a place people go when they're desperate, a last resort, not a business strategy. From the business side, it's a carefully engineered system where both possible outcomes of every single transaction are profitable, and where the real skill isn't charging high interest, it's knowing exactly what to lend against, and how quickly to turn it back into cash before it becomes dead weight on a shelf. If you found this kind of business breakdown useful, subscribe, hit like, and drop a comment telling us which business or industry you want us to break down next. Your suggestions genuinely shape what we cover.